Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kendra Nixon. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the director of Resolve Manitoba. On behalf of Resolve and Circling Buffalo, I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is for our study, Improving Shelter Experience for Indigenous Women in Manitoba. The information that we're presenting today is based on the results of that study. Next slide. But before I begin, or before we begin, I would like to recognize the land that we are meeting on today. Even though we are meeting remotely and we are scattered across the province and perhaps the prairies and perhaps even the country, it's important that we acknowledge the land we are meeting on. Personally, I'm at my office, at the Resolve office at Fort Garry campus at the University of Manitoba, which is located on Treaty 1 territory. Recognizing that I'm a visitor on this land and that Indigenous peoples have inherent rights because they are First Peoples, it's important to reconciliation. So in doing so, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses, including the Resolve office, is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Innuit, Assinineewak, Dakota Yate, Dene, and Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. With that, I would like now to ask Elder Marilyn Hart-Murdoch to say an opening prayer and to open today's webinar in a good way. Elder Marilyn.
Okay, thank you, Kendra. Tanse Bonjour. I just want to say miigwech for, all the Ikwayuk, the women, and, with all the work that you've provided and that you searched and, to reach for a better way of life for, our life givers. I'd like to give thanks for all the life givers, including mine and all those that are gone before us. It's very important to remember Ikwayuk. They carry the heartbeat of our families, our people. So with that, I just want to say miigwech everyone, all the women, all our daughters and granddaughters. I just like to say miigwech for being a life giver. Aho, have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elder Marilyn. And I know you need to kind of go back to your other position. So again, I want to thank you for your words and of course being involved in this project and for opening up our webinar this afternoon. So miigwech.
Okay, enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Next slide. So before we get into the details of our study and the results, I do want to acknowledge several people and several organizations who made this work possible. It was the love and the work of a lot of people. And I first want to say that we opened up the project in November in 2023 in ceremony. We had an opening sweat, and I want to thank and acknowledge Elder Norman Campbell Red Sky for opening our project in a good way. I also want to thank our members of our advisory circle for their ongoing guidance and feedback throughout this research, including Elder Marilyn, who just provided the opening words. But certainly Teresa and Sharon from Circling Buffalo, Katina from the First Nation Healing Center, Elder Marilyn from the First Nation Healing Center, Tal East and Betty Monias from the Pearl Smith Memorial Women's Emergency Shelter, and Cynthia at the Matthias Colomb Cree Nation. So thanks you so much for our advisory circle who really led this project. I also want to thank our many research staff for their hard work on this project, including Masha Kardashkaya, who was the original research associate who started this project and is no longer with Resolve Manitoba. But it was Masha's idea, along with members of the advisory circle, who came up with this project. So, miigwech to Masha. As well, our research assistants, Vanessa, who you will meet, who conducted all of the interviews, as well as Eloise, who has done a lot of the analysis and write-up, Emma Cowman, who was a previous research assistant with Resolve and also did the transcribing and the analysis. Ali Arthurs, who will be presenting on the GIS mapping later on, and Grace Hallwell, who also did some of the analysis. But I also want to thank the many survivors and service providers who participated in our project, who took time to share their stories, even the difficult ones, to help with this project. So we are very grateful for their participation, for their knowledge, their wisdom. We really hope that their voices and this work will lead to progress and positive change. So we greatly appreciate your words and your contributions. And then finally, I'd like to thank our funder, Women and Gender Equality Canada, for their financial support. Next slide. So I also want to acknowledge that this project was done in collaboration with Circling Buffalo. So I just want to thank again to Teresa and Sharon for all of their support. This was a collaborative project. And so what today will look like is I'm going to hand it over to our three research staff, Vanessa, Eloise, and Ali, who will probably take about 10 to 15 minutes each and talk about their components of the project. And then we'll have a few minutes for conversation, questions and answers. And then we will be completed around 3:30. All of the participants, so all of the registrants, so all of you, you'll have your mics off the entire time as well as your camera. When it is time for the conversation, the questions and answers, you will be able to put your questions into the Q&A. So, and then I will moderate that discussion. So that is how today we're going to unfold the webinar, but I also want to begin with a note of care. So we're talking about intimate partner violence among Indigenous women in Manitoba. And so some of the material you may find upsetting. So please be mindful of what you need, and please take care of yourself in the ways that make sense to you. We do have a listing of resources here if you need those. Next slide. So I'm not going to say a whole lot about the kind of the nuts and bolts of the study, as we'll hear that in a bit. But we understand that Indigenous women in Canada experience disproportionately high rates of intimate partner violence, leading to greater reliance on emergency shelters. And that's not just in Canada, that's specifically in Manitoba, where the rates of intimate partner violence and violence against women are one of the highest in the country. We know that many communities, especially in rural and northern regions, face limited access to shelters, resulting in many women being turned away or forced to travel far from their supports. We also know that existing services are often underfunded and may not reflect Indigenous cultural safety, highlighting the need for more culturally grounded and community-led approaches. And so we embarked on this study to explore the experiences of survivors as well as those who serve them, so service providers, to understand what their shelter needs are in Manitoba. There's no literature or almost no literature on the specific needs of Indigenous women as they move into crisis shelters or try to attempt to use them. So the purpose of our study was to explore and understand and really to amplify the voices of Indigenous women's experiences in shelters across Manitoba. So we focused on access, service delivery, their satisfaction, and their recommendations for improving practices and policy. So these are our guiding questions. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but essentially we wanted to know what Indigenous women's experiences were with accessing and staying at Indigenous and non-Indigenous led shelters. So you know that we have provincially funded shelters that are largely non-Indigenous. We also have First Nation shelters as well, often in rural and remote and northern areas. So we wanted to understand how Indigenous women, so those who identify as, First Nation, as Métis, or a mixture of those identities, and Inuit, and a mixture of those identities. So we want to know how they access the shelter, what were some of the challenges or barriers if they didn't, and what were some of the challenges that they experienced while staying in shelter. We also wanted to know service providers' experiences, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous service providers who support Indigenous women in rural and urban and northern shelters in Manitoba. Again, so what kind of challenges that they face, what works, what does not work, and then lastly, how to improve existing IPV-specific services in shelter for Indigenous women in rural, northern, and urban areas of Manitoba. Next slide. So about our study. So as I mentioned, we began by opening it up in a good way. We hosted a sweat, which was led by Elder Norman Campbell Red Sky. We also conducted an extensive literature review to guide the study. We will have a QR code at the end, so if you want to access that literature, you can. And we worked closely and we partnered with Circling Buffalo. And this project was led by an Indigenous advisory circle made up of the shelter directors of the First Nation reserves, who I mentioned earlier in the acknowledgement section. And with them, we co-developed the study focus, the purpose, the questions, and the interview approach. So this was truly a collaborative effort. Vanessa, who you will meet in a second, is an Indigenous, was an MSW IK student in our Indigenous Knowledges program, but has since graduated. So Vanessa completed all of the interviews to ensure that they were culturally grounded and involved a relational process, which is quite important for the study. Again, we received ongoing guidance from our advisory circle. And then we concluded the project with the talking circle that we had a couple of weeks ago. And then finally, all of our participants or those who were interested received a summary of results that were in plain language, so that would be accessible to them. So I'm going to have Vanessa, Eloise, and Ali speak to how we conducted our study and the results. But I just want to say broadly that we had 24 conversations overall, so 24 interviews, including 12 Indigenous survivors and 12 service providers who work closely with Indigenous communities and shelters. All of the interviews or conversations were recorded, transcribed, coded, and analyzed to identify major themes and patterns. And we're currently in the process now of writing that up. And if anyone is interested, that report will be posted on the RESOLVE website, to which we have a link at the end of the presentation. And then Ali will present on the digital mapping that really illustrates the journeys and the geographical barriers that influenced women's help seeking. Next slide, please. So just briefly, before I hand it over to Vanessa, in terms of our participant eligibility, so we spoke to survivors who were adults, so 18 years of older, who I self-identified as being Indigenous, so that could be First Nations, Métis, Inuit, or a mix or other ways. Identified as women, either cis-born, two-spirit, and transgender women were also included. They had to have resided in Manitoba at the time of help seeking for intimate partner violence because it was a focus on Manitoba programs and happened to be in the last 5 years, so we can have a current understanding of programs. They have had to have accessed women's shelters, but as Vanessa might speak to, we actually included a lot of survivors who actually didn't access shelters but tried to, but because of multiple barriers, they weren't able to. Um, but for safety reasons, all of our partners had to have been living safely away from their abusive partner. Um, and yes, so well, I think we have that. That's probably repeated. The last point. In terms of service providers, they had to have had experience working in a women's shelter, whether that was Indigenous or non-Indigenous, but had provided services to Indigenous women in Manitoba in the last 5 years. Next. All right. I think now I will pass it over to Vanessa, and Vanessa can talk about her experience of recruiting survivors and service providers, as well as what those conversations look like. Vanessa.
Good afternoon, bonjour. My name is Walks Amongst the Bears, and I'm from the Black Stallion clan. My English name is Vanessa Monkman, and I'm from Lake Manitoba First Nation, which is located in the Treaty 2 territory on Turtle Island. And my journey here began with Resolve and Circling Buffalo as a student at the University of Manitoba in the Master of Social Work and Indigenous Knowledges program. And so primarily my responsibility was to do the interviews. So at the beginning, what would happen, there was a poster that was sent out to shelters and with a phone number, with an email, and I would get that information. So my my responsibility was to follow up with all of those emails and all of those calls that were made who were potential participants who wanted to participate in this project. And so once once I would get their information, I would follow up with them. I would call them, I would send them an email, and basically try to recruit them for this process. I would inform them of the project, about eligibility, some of my background, some of Resolve and Circling Buffalo's background, and just to provide the information to participants who wanted to share their stories and share their experiences. And so when I would follow up with participants, we would do the introductions. We would talk about just the pre-screening process, which included going over confidentiality and all of those portions. And then once that was done, if they wanted to move forward and also if they were eligible, because at the same time, this whole process, if anybody wanted to take a step back or anybody wanted to take a break or anybody wanted to maybe shelf this for a little while or maybe they didn't want to go forward with the process, then they would just let me know. Or sometimes too, sometimes I didn't hear back from some participants. So I really just my responsibility was to inform the participants, but also be respectful of where people were at in terms of being able to tell their story. So once if folks wanted to move forward in terms of the process, they were required to have an email, and that was for being able to receive the honorarium, but also in order for them to receive the consent. And while we acknowledge that there's difficulty with having access to internet and things like that, we try to work around some of those issues with maybe participants would rely on shelter staff or other folks in who worked in the shelters or even a community resource to be able to help them if they didn't have an email or even have a phone. So once the consent forms were sent out, I would just wait for them. Basically, my point was to be flexible to the participants' if they wanted to take a few days, maybe they even wanted to take a few weeks. Some even took a few months to do the consent forms. I would do my best to explain about the consent forms, but sometimes too, it all leads up into folks telling their story. So sometimes, again, people would take a step back in that process. So once the consent forms were received, and then we would go into the interview. Um, the interviews generally lasted anywhere from half an hour to a maximum of 2 hours. But once we began the interview, we wouldn't be able to do the interview on another day. Um, the interviews were, I was guided by questions to do the interviews, but also in the interviews, I let folks tell their story. Um, what they wanted to share. Sometimes their answers didn't quite answer the question. And to me, that was okay because I was just there to listen and to hear what folks wanted to share. Because sometimes too, participants came in the interview wanting to tell their own story. They wanted to practice telling their own story. And so for me, in all of the interviews, I was a guest in listening to what folks wanted to share. Um, the other thing too, I should have mentioned about the interviews. Sure, we would maybe schedule it on let's say a Friday afternoon. But if folks, were busy, something came up, they wanted to reschedule to the next day, maybe even the next week. I was very flexible in terms of that interview process and in terms of scheduling, and I just basically let the people tell me when they were available. I was flexible with how the timing of the interview, how long it went. I was just there as a guest, in my opinion. Once the interviews were completed, and each participant received a $50 honorarium, which was usually done by email money transfer, but sometimes folks didn't have access to email money transfers. So the honorarium was dropped off with maybe somebody at the shelter or with maybe they went to a community resource center, and it was dropped off with a staff member who was assisting them in that process. So each participant received a $50 honorarium. I also had the opportunity to do in-person interviews. And so in that process, they were just provided with that honorarium. The in-person interviews were slightly different from the phone and Zoom interviews, primarily because, I mean, when you go into a community, you're a guest in the community, and you get to experience, them telling their story to you. So the interviews were much different doing them in person compared to doing them maybe on the phone or through Zoom, even though the majority of the interviews were done by phone. And again, too, with the interviews, if they were done by Zoom or in person, well, not really by in person, but Zoom or by phone, I let them choose what they wanted to do. Sometimes, too, there was difficulty with technical difficulties connecting through Zoom. So then we would just move over to doing a phone interview, which was much easier for most folks. Um, is there another slide? Okay. Challenges with recruitment. So I talked about that a bit earlier about not all survivor participants move forward to the next step. So sometimes maybe they wanted to reach out through phone or through email, and I would follow up with them. But then maybe some moved over to doing the pre-screening, and maybe some moved over to doing the consent form, but maybe not everybody went towards the interview. So each person, they may have stopped at a different point that was up to them and how they wanted to do in their own journey. I found that there were a lot of interest in the interviews and a lot of interest to participate, but not everybody moved forward to each section, I guess, of the interview process. Um, the other One of the other challenges with the recruitment was if folks were calling from a shelter, sometimes it was difficult to get in contact with them because I would then follow up and call the shelter and due to confidentiality and whatnot, I would be able to leave a message and sometimes I didn't always get a call back. I mentioned this before about Zoom, just because of connection issues, we weren't always able to have a Zoom interview, and so we would then have go over to a phone interview. Also, what had occurred was last year, as everyone may know, that the wildfires in Manitoba impacted a lot of First Nation communities and folks living in various areas in our province. And so with the wildfires, I wasn't able to make contact with some of those shelters or some of those participants during that time because of the wildfires. So after I was done the interviews, um, I had my own reflections at the same time. And so one of my reflections was that to me, it was incredibly important to handle the information that people were sharing with care because it's very important that when they're sharing with what they're sharing with you, it's like a gift. And at the same time, and anything could be added to that or but anything could be taken away or anything could be translated in a different way. But we always have to remember that when folks are sharing, especially sensitive and personal information at times, or they're about their journey, that information is handled with care and that it is translated accordingly. The other part of my reflection and something I often reflect about and think about is some of the participants that I had met along the way. There's humor we use as Indigenous people, as First Nations people, and when I think about some of the participants, we had those moments of where humor was used, whether it was on my part or whether it was on a participant's part, and how we relate to one another as Indigenous people. And so that was part of my reflection. A big part of this whole process is uplifting and honoring participants, folks that shared their story with me, and how they shared it and what they expressed during those moments. But also, I would also like to uplift and honor all of the participants who expressed interest in participating, who didn't get to do an interview for what their reasons are on their own journeys, that I uplift you and I uplift and honor those who weren't able to participate, just because you are also acknowledged in this way. Um, the other thing, and something I hold dear to my heart as a First Nations woman and Indigenous person, is that we're always hoping for change. We're always hoping that things will change for the goodness of our people and uh, that good things are coming. And so from participating in this project, I hope too that participants' voices are heard, that that there that there's equality there, that there's fairness there, and that most importantly, that their voices are heard and that changes are coming. So that's all on my part. Jimmy Gwetch for listening.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. I'm going to hand it over now to Eloise, who worked a lot with the analysis. But I also want to invite you as well, Vanessa, if you want to kind of chime in, if you feel you need to, because you did these interviews, right? And I think it's really important for you to also share if you have any thoughts as Eloise is presenting, as well as when Ali is as well. So, Miigwech, Vanessa, and Eloise, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So I'll be essentially going over the main themes and the findings from both the service provider and survivors conversations. So first off, we're going to be starting with our survivors. We had conversations with 12 survivors, all of them identified as Indigenous, 11 identified as women, one woman noted being in a same-sex relationship, and one identified as two spirits. The age range was between 25 to 59 years of age. And regarding location, 8 were in an urban location, 3 were residing on reserve, and 1 in a rural location. Next slide, please. So what survivors told us, survivors disclosed various forms of abuse that they experienced, some being physical, emotional, verbal, and financial abuse, as well as coercive control and substance use coercion. Next slide, please. Survivors also detailed the shelter services they had access to while they were in shelter, some of them including cultural supports, such as traditional ceremonies and medicines, beading, cultural foods, drumming, sharing circles, and access to elders were mentioned but talked about less. I do want to mention survivors who did access shelter at an Indigenous shelter did have more access to cultural supports than those who accessed a non-Indigenous shelter. Survivors also mentioned accessing counseling services, transportation services, child supports, clothing, assistance with housing, legal services, and employment income assistance. Next slide, please. So regarding challenges survivors faced in shelter, I will name some, such as limited support from staff. So as you can see, I did include some of the stories of survivors because they are best at telling their stories, right? One of them mentioned the need for staff to really create a safe space for survivors where they're able to understand what resources are available to them and as well to just have a listening ear, right? Another survivor also mentioned how some of the interactions with workers, they didn't take the time to really explain the services that were available to them. Some survivors faced discrimination while in shelter, including racism and homophobia. One survivor mentioned how Indigenous women were picked on in the shelter that they were accessing. Another mentioned being moved out of the shelter that they were at due to being two-spirit. Next slide, please. Some survivors shared how shelter staff had minimal knowledge of Indigenous communities and cultures. One survivor mentioned that they preferred going to an Indigenous shelter because non-Indigenous shelters didn't have that much in-depth knowledge of their culture or their backgrounds. Another survivor mentioned the importance of culturally sensitive training for all staff to ensure they understand generational trauma and our history. Survivors also talked about working through difficult emotions after leaving an abusive relationship. One survivor mentioned the transition from going from a chaotic environment, they described it as, to shelter and just the process of calming down. Some survivors also shared that they were not offered counseling supports in shelters. Next slide, please. So a little bit about their help-seeking experiences. Some survivors got help from formal supports such as police, hospital staff, counseling supports, substance use support services, and chief and council. Some survivors also got help from informal supports, including family, friends, elders, co-workers, and their community. However, there were some survivors who didn't reach out to any supports while experiencing abuse. Next slide, please. So to talk about the barriers survivors faced while accessing supports, survivors mentioned the difficulties contacting shelters and being unaware of the shelter locations. Some also identified, well, survivors who were single and did not have families realized the barriers they face when accessing shelters, as some shelters only accepted women and families. Some survivors also mentioned that some shelters were just had full capacity, and had long wait lists, which made it hard for them to get in. Some survivors also shared the feelings of shame and stigma, which held them back from accessing supports. Additionally, some even talked about fear of discrimination. Our Two-Spirit survivor talked about the fear of calling the cops because they saw that cops would believe the woman in the relationship and they presented as a man. Next slide, please. Another barrier survivors faced was transportation barriers. This was mentioned by the survivor who struggled with getting bus fare to access shelter. Next slide, please. So regarding shelter experiences, 8 survivors had a positive experience in shelter. As you can see from this quote, one survivor mentioned that they felt welcomed and they felt like it was a non-judgmental space. 3 survivors also mentioned having a neutral experience in shelter. And one survivor noted having a negative experience in shelter, sharing that if they had to do it all over again, and if the cops told them they had to go to the same shelter, that they would rather just go back to their environment. Next slide, please. So now I'll be talking about our conversations with service providers. So we had conversations with 12 service providers, all of them identified as Indigenous. 11 service providers worked at Indigenous shelters, whereas one worked at a non-Indigenous shelter. The years of experience or service, varied. Some having less than a year in their shelter that they were at, some having 7+ years working at the shelter that they were at. The roles also varied. We interviewed 5 support workers, 3 directors, 1 assistant director, 2 elders, and 1 support worker / security guard. Next slide, please. So shelter services. Service providers talked about the various services their shelter offers, such as cultural services, including traditional ceremonies, access to elders, access to medicines, sharing circles. Some also talked about offering counseling supports, hygiene kits, baby formula and diapers, as well as clothing, assistance with getting identification documents, access to healthcare, securing housing, educational supports, and other resources. Some also mentioned providing transportation services. Next slide, please. So the challenges that service providers witnessed survivors go through when they were in shelter were feelings of loneliness. They noticed that survivors were experiencing loneliness due to leaving their families and their communities to seek shelter. They've also observed that survivors had a hard time adjusting to shelter rules as well as difficulty accessing housing. This was a barrier since a lot of survivors that they were working with would get labeled when viewing housing and so on. Next slide, please. Additionally, they observed that policy restrictions was a barrier or a challenge that survivors faced, specifically a policy that prevents boys over the age of 12 from staying in shelter with their parents. One survivor honestly emphasizing how that would be a big barrier for women leaving their child behind because they are male and they are over the age of 11 or 12. Service providers also talked about witnessing survivors or some survivors go through withdrawal symptoms from substance use. Additionally, some observed that transportation was a big barrier when seeking services outside of the city. They observed that survivors had barriers receiving income assistance, as well as difficulty contacting shelters for information. Next slide, please. So we also talked about the challenges that service providers face as well. Challenges service providers faced in their roles were securing housing for survivors due to the limited housing availabilities. Additionally, getting social assistance for survivors was a challenge. Managing policy restrictions, again, specifically the policy preventing older boys from staying in shelter with their parents. Dealing with safety concerns within their community due to their work, as well as emotional strains that come with their role. Next slide, please. So the recommendations. The first recommendation was to offer more cultural and traditional services in shelters. And I just want to say in both non-Indigenous and Indigenous shelters. Second was to address staff shortages and knowledge gaps. Third was to provide longer shelter stays and transitional housing. Fourth was more education and community outreach. And fifth was more collaboration among IPV, intimate partner violence services. Thank you. Next slide.
So Vanessa, I don't know if you have anything to add. If not, that's okay. And then we'll move over to Ellie. But I just wanted to give you the opportunity, Vanessa, if you wanted to comment on anything that Eloise presented as you engaged in conversations with everyone.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that come to mind, and certainly in our conversations and with Circling Buffalo and Resolve and our the staff that we worked with and all of that, and but just in some of my reflections from after the interviews, and maybe I'm going off topic here a little bit, but um, in terms of recommendations and that hope for change that with some of the let's say education or more knowledge um, for staff or for shelters for there to be more training in regards to when dealing with Indigenous women, whether that's more, I know it says cultural training, but I think in almost some ways it needs to be more stated because a lot of Indigenous women in this whole process voiced, just some difficulty when it comes to um, accessing non-Indigenous shelters, that there's um, that they feel misunderstood. And so more training for staff when it comes to dealing with Indigenous women, just in a general sense.
Thanks, Vanessa. Allie, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Ali Arthurs. I am a research assistant at RESOLVE Manitoba and a Master of Social Work student. So I joined this project in July, and I was responsible for completing the digital mapping component. Before I get into the story map that we created, I thought I would first talk a little bit about why we use geographic approaches and tools in intimate partner violence research. So we know that geographic location influences survivors' experiences of intimate partner violence and help seeking for intimate partner violence. And maps, they can provide powerful visual tools. So they can help us visualize the location and distribution of incidents of intimate partner violence, the location and distribution of infrastructure and resources for help seeking, and also to visualize survivors' help seeking journeys. And all of that is powerful for things like observing patterns and trends in intimate partner violence and in intimate partner violence help seeking, in highlighting geographic gaps, disparities, and barriers, and in guiding the funding and allocation of future intimate partner violence services and resources, and informing intimate partner violence service delivery, policy, and research. So how and why we used geographic tools and approaches in this project. So a goal of this project was to better understand and illustrate how geographic factors influence the help-seeking experiences of Indigenous women in Manitoba. So with that goal in mind, then the task was to create a story map. It combines maps, text, and multimedia content to create a digital, visual, and interactive story about the help-seeking journeys and experiences of survivors. So that required multiple tools, all of which are on ArcGIS Online. That's a geographic information system software, GIS software, for creating, analyzing, and sharing maps and geographic information. And because I was brand new to GIS and GIS mapping, it was quite a long journey that required a lot of steps and a lot of learning. So some of that involved learning how to use and apply geographic software, tools, and approaches. So our research, visualization, and GIS librarian, Meg Miller, she connected me with some online training modules to complete on ArcGIS Online. And then also I was reading literature on GIS and learning all about that. And then I wanted to also learn about how are geographic tools and approaches used in intimate partner violence research. So again, I looked at literature relating specifically to IPV and GIS, and some of that is what I showed in the previous slide. The sources were listed at the bottom, and they're also on the reference list at the end of the PowerPoint. The next step was reviewing all of the conversations with survivors and service providers and gathering information related to geography, and then gathering and creating all of the geographic information, so the geographic components of the story map that involves GIS data, the feature layers, the web maps and apps, all of that kind of thing. And then the narrative information. So that came from conversations with interviews, from our literature review, from other news articles, reports, literature, that kind of thing. And then once all of those components were created, the geographic and narrative components, then it was time to start the actual design and formatting of the story map. Grace Hallwell, who was mentioned at the beginning, she no longer works at Resolve, but she was on this project. She helped with the design. We took inspiration from the Circling Buffalo website, as well as purple being the color for intimate partner violence. So then once that was done, then it was finally time to compile and integrate both the geographic and the narrative components into the story map and create one cohesive story. So yeah, as you can see by all of the steps, it was quite a journey and a lot of learning, and it took about 6 months to complete. And I'm very, very grateful for all of the ongoing discussion and collaboration with the advisory circle, the principal investigator, Kendra, and the librarian, Meg Miller. I couldn't have done this without them, so thank you very much. And of course, to the service providers and the survivors, couldn't have created this without their knowledge and wisdom either. Okay, so now a little bit about the story map. So on the slide, you'll see a picture of, this is the cover page of the story map. And sorry, just to clarify, the story map is an online digital story. So, and I'll be getting into this a little bit further on, but this is something that will be accessible to the public, and it's yeah, digital and interactive, and it's open access and all those things. But these are just a few screenshots of what the story map looks like, but interacting with it is a lot different once you actually open the story map. So in the end, we created an 8-part story. So there's, as you'll see in the second image there, there's of that heading at the top, there's 8 sections. There's an acknowledgement section, introduction, and then 3 kind of main components that cover the main themes. So mapping journeys, mapping transportation, and mapping crisis supports and services. And then there's a conclusion, a glossary, and some references. So you can navigate the story map either by clicking on those headings at the top or by just scrolling through. And then after each map, there is narrative that explains and interprets and supplements the map. And that is based on quotes and information from service provider and service provider and survivor interviews, and then also from other multimedia content. And that's embedded throughout the story map. So you'll see buttons and underlined words, and that will either lead you to an additional resource or to the glossary in the story map. Sorry, the slide is frozen. Oh, there we go. So, what informed and inspired the story map? So, as I mentioned previously, the knowledge, the wisdom, and the experiences of survivors and service providers, the guidance and the input and advice from the advisory circle, and the GIS and research visualization librarian, and research, literature, and media reports on various topics related to IPV, GIS, indigeneity, and colonialism. In particular, this map was informed by areas like critical GIS. So that is looking at geographic information systems as political technologies. It asserts that the technologies, GIS technology, and the people who use them are not neutral, and they do inherently contain biases, and that we must be aware of that when we're creating these maps. Another area is decolonial GIS. That is an area that challenges colonial spatial views and practices. So an example of how colonial GIS informed this project was intentionally placing the Indigenous place names first before the English names on the map, and including creating map labels of Indigenous place names. Oh, and then also feminist GIS. That was another area that informed the story map. So feminist GIS, that's using geographic information systems to analyze and reveal gendered experiences, and also emphasizes the importance of applying an intersectional analysis to your GIS research. Okay. So now a brief overview of what is featured in the map. So as I've mentioned before, there's three main themes that are related to geographic influences and barriers to help seeking. So the first theme is survivors' journeys to shelter. So that illustrates the mobility and the displacement of survivors. And by mobility, I mean how survivors traveled to shelter, how long it took, and how long those journeys took. By displacement, I mean instances of survivors having to leave their home community to access shelter. Access to transportation was the next theme explored in the story map. This looks at the transportation infrastructure in Manitoba and transportation barriers that are unique to northern and remote First Nation communities. So looking at increased costs that are due to transportation barriers, and looking at the impacts of climate change. So for example, how in remote communities that are only accessible by winter ice roads, how warming temperatures impact that and make those roads not drivable or unsafe, and impact the mobility of survivors. Lastly, looking at access to intimate partner violence related crisis supports and services. So the distribution of help-seeking resources across Manitoba. This includes emergency medical facilities and services, mental health and addiction services, police services, legal services, cell phone and internet connectivity, IPV-specific initiatives, and emergency pet shelters. All themes are explored and explained using a combination of maps and narrative, as I mentioned, and all themes are analyzed and discussed in relation to colonialism. That's because we wanted to ensure that we were highlighting how geographic differences and inequalities have systemic and structural causes. They're not just naturally occurring, and they're not accidental either. Okay, so now a couple examples from pages of the story map. So this is covering the first theme, mapping journeys. This is an example of so we did one map that shows all the gender-based violence shelters in Manitoba. And then this is just an example of another map that's showing the time of travel of survivor journeys. And then within this section, there are a lot more maps. And on the story map, you'll see that you click through them kind of like you would a slideshow presentation. And so there's other maps that show not only the time of travel, but the mode of travel, and then also that show more specifics of the journey. And I know that it might look a little blurry and maybe a bit confusing when you're looking at it like this in a still image. But once you get in there and interact with it and are able to really look at the map legend and everything, it becomes a lot more clear. But essentially what this map is showing, so the color of the lines and the shape of the lines are used to denote the mode and duration of travel to shelter. And then after the map, as I said, there's always a narrative component. So as you scroll past this map, you'll find a narrative component that really interprets and explains and supplements this map. So that is one area. And then access to transportation, the second area or theme of the map. So here, there's maps showing Manitoba's road network. There's also additional maps of showing the air travel, the long-haul bus travel, and train travel across Manitoba. Additionally, there's a map that shows the impact of climate change on transportation access. So that map has a toggle feature. So there's a sliding bar that you can pull over the map, and it shows the wildfire perimeters. It overlays the wildfire perimeters on the transportation map so you can see how wildfire might impact transportation. And then another image I've included here. So there's also a cost breakdown graph of that illustrates the cost of a shelter transfer from a Northern First Nation community, and that was based on a quote from a service provider that's shared in the story map as well. And I should also mention that these maps, they are interactive, so when you scroll over the icons, you will see pop-up information. You can also zoom in and out of the map. You can search for places on the map, that kind of thing. And then lastly, the third theme, access to crisis supports and services. So this is probably the most robust map. And this actually is an app. So you can open it outside of the story map itself. And that might be a more user-friendly way to view it. I know it looks very busy and jumbled right now. That's because currently all of the map layers are turned on. You'll see in those gray squares that they're all ticked off, but you can untick some of those boxes and you can just look at one crisis support or service at a time. But yeah, and again, as with all the other maps, there's an interactive component. So if you hover over the icons, it will pop up with information about contact or hours, that kind of thing. And then, yeah, I have just an example of what a narrative component might look like after a map. So here I have the narrative that comes after the crisis supports and services map, just explaining and interpreting the geographic differences in crisis supports and services that are seen on the map, particularly focusing on emergency mental health and addiction services and phone and internet connection, as those were two crisis supports and services that were mentioned as vital to help seeking in the interviews. Okay, so now a few lessons from the story map. So the main takeaway, the help-seeking journey of journeys of Indigenous survivors, particularly those from remote First Nation communities, may involve increased instances of displacement and longer, more complex and costly journeys. And this is largely tied to the legacy and continuation of colonialism. So as I mentioned previously, the impacts of climate change and also spatial inequality and marginalization. So the unequal distribution of resources, of opportunities, and treatment amongst different geographical areas as a result and a method of social exclusion and control. The maps show that a survivor may be forced to relocate from their community due to a lack of access to culturally safe shelter services, a lack of anonymity, and a lack of local infrastructure and resources for help seeking. The maps and the narrative also shows how on these journeys to access shelter and other resources, excesses and limitations may be placed on a survivor's mobility. That's due to far proximity to supports and services, due to a lack of transportation infrastructure, due to the impacts of climate change, and due to a lack of telecommunications infrastructure, a lack of phone and internet access and connection. Okay, so in addition to that main takeaway, there's a few other takeaways from the story map. So I think one is the importance of an in-depth and broad understanding of access. So placing that within social, historical, and political context, making sure that it's inclusive of the many determinants of access. So the story map really primarily looked at how geography and geographic location impacts access, but the rest of the study really demonstrated that access is determined by like a wide variety of factors, and geographic location being only one of them. So you have to have a very comprehensive and cumulative kind of appreciation for how they all might impact survivors' journeys. Also, the importance of an intersectional understanding of access as well, acknowledging the interplay of these determinants. So also, I think the story map through both maps and the narrative highlight how the interplay of racism, of patriarchy, and of geographic inequality that are all imposed by colonialism, how they interact in to adversely impact the help-seeking experiences of Indigenous survivors. And then another thing to consider in terms of access is that just because the infrastructure or resource is available doesn't mean it's accessible. The interviews highlighted that transportation might be inaccessible because of the financial cost, or that on the map you'll see that the long haul buses, they are not wheelchair accessible, so they might be available but not accessible, that kind of thing. Also, another thing that was limiting accessibility was long wait lists. So services, especially in Winnipeg, might be available but not accessible due to wait lists, costs, that kind of thing. And then, so that was one other takeaway. And then another takeaway is the importance of having an awareness of Western colonial and ableist biases. So I was hoping to use a base map like the main map that is used for all of the maps. I was hoping to use one that predominantly featured all of the Indigenous place names in so-called Canada, but there wasn't one that existed. So I used the best available one, which is OpenStreetMaps, and that's a kind of community-based and community-led collaborative map. So some people have started including Indigenous place names, and then as another workaround, I ended up creating map labels myself for some of the feature layers. But yeah, currently there was no available base map that I could just download and use as is. So that's definitely a gap there. And then also that some existing geospatial data sets, they lacked information on Indigenous owned and operated services or services located on reserve. So ones that I had downloaded from ArcGIS Online that were previously created, I had to cross-reference that they were not missing services. And it's likely that I still did miss some services. And so that's another gap and a way that bias is apparent. Also, the story map is not fully accessible to people who are colorblind or deaf. This is due to limitations in the platform accessibility features itself, and then also in limitations in time and funding in my own knowledge and experience. So there is alt text included for the images, but it's still not fully accessible to people who are colorblind or deaf. So that's definitely a limitation. And then lastly, the importance of recognizing and critically reflecting on the influence of my own identity and positionality as a white settler born and raised in so-called Canada. So the importance of recognizing how my own biases and ideas around space and land might influence the creation of the maps. Lastly, just a little bit on how to access the story map. So it will be available online. It can be opened on a variety of technological devices, such as a phone, a tablet, or a computer. A computer is recommended just because the story map is quite robust. And so it's better to have something that could handle um, can load that better. I don't know. I'm not a tech person, but I hope that made sense. Um, and also it can be printed as a PDF, but as I mentioned, the map is interactive, and so that will limit the interaction. And then also, some of the content as well is embedded. It's interactive, like you click on the links or you click on the buttons, and obviously that won't work in a PDF either. But you still can print it and kind of get at least a general sense of what the story map is about. And it can also be shared via link and QR code. And lastly, it is open access. So there's no payment. You don't need an account. You don't need registration to view it. And I've included the link there. I think that's all from me. Kendra, I'll pass it to you.
Sure. If you could move to the next slide then.
Oh, sure.
Great. Thanks, Allie. That was great. So yeah, that wraps up the presentation component of today's webinar. So you heard a little bit about what the study was about, how we conducted it, what our main findings were in terms of the interviews with survivors and service providers, as well as the extensive story map that Ali created. So before there's any questions or comments, I maybe just want to put it out to the advisory circle. If there's anyone joining us today, if they have any comments or any thoughts about the process, about the results, I just want to give you the opportunity to say anything. So I think Sharon, you're on. So I know you were with the shelter liaison with Circling Buffalo. So I don't know if Sharon, not to put you on the spot, and I don't know, maybe you're not, maybe you left, but I'm just curious to see if you have anything to add as well. Okay. Well, then we can now move to any questions and comments. I don't have a Q&A. I just see the chat, Luke. I don't know if is there a section for Q&A?
Yep, under more, it should be Q&A.
Oh, okay, I didn't. Okay. So I don't see any open questions. That's probably why it didn't pop up. But we have about 10, 15 minutes if people have any comments, questions, thoughts. Here we go. So Priscilla, thank you for an insightful presentation. This was very informative. Thanks, Priscilla. And we will have all of this available on the Resolve website. As I said, we're just finalizing the final report, and as well as the story map. They will be up on the Resolve website, which I believe we have a link to in a slide in a second, but just wanted to see if there were any more questions or comments. And Nadine, thanks, Nadine. Nadine said, thanks very much, Kendra and the team. Looking forward to seeing the materials online soon. And Nadine, you are certainly on our list of people and organizations who we want to share this information with. All of our research is really about action-oriented results that leads to ultimately better policies and practices and service for survivors of intimate partner violence and gender-based violence and those who serve them. So we'll be sending this to you, and hopefully this can start up, conversations about what we can do better. Okay, Linda, it says the first slide about results says that the participants mentioned access to supports. Does this mean that all the shelters provided access to these supports, or were the supports mentioned because the participants wanted or might not have received these supports? Eloise and Vanessa, do you want to talk about that? I guess I could, I'll just say that no, not all the shelters provided these supports. These were just some that collectively the participants referred to. But perhaps Eloise or Vanessa, I'll let you answer that.
Vanessa, do you want to go ahead or?
Yeah, Linda's asking about what supports the shelters offer, and I suspect there's a range, right, depending on where the shelters are.
Exactly, yeah. It was just a list of what they talked about, all the different service providers talked about, kind of providing these different supports. Not one shelter provided all of the support. It was like a collective kind of information.
Yeah, the other thing too to mention, I know some specific First Nation shelters offered cultural supports if needed for participants, and so just wanted to make note of that.
Okay, I'm just looking at. Sorry, I'm just kind of going through here. I don't want to miss anybody's questions. And I see there is one message in the chat. Oh, okay. Interesting webinar, or as I just completed a feminist perspective course, and a lot of this information was helpful in training with that course. Casey, I'm glad that you find the information useful. And of course, all of this will be on the Resolve website, and you can certainly email me as well if you have any questions. And sorry, I see Sharon is trying to access her microphone. Sharon, if you want to type something in the chat, I'm happy to to relay that onto the group. Sharon is the shelter liaison with Circling Buffalo and was an important member on the all the members of the advisory circle, really important. But being with Circling Buffalo, who is also kind of the major partner on this grant. So Sharon, if you want, you can certainly type your message in the chat and I will relay that. Linda says, love the use of story map. Yeah, it's really, really incredible, Linda. And the webinar, I mean, Ali did a magnificent job talking about the story map. But you really, the webinar doesn't do it justice. You really have to get into it and you have to interact with it for you to really get a sense of its power and its value and strength. So, I suggest you access that. And yes, anyone can access the map. We will be posting it online on the Resolve website. We can also share this PowerPoint as well. But in the meantime, if you want to email me, I can send you the link directly. But yes, anybody can access it. Okay, I don't know if there's any other. I'm kind of going back and forth from the questions and the chat. So, okay. So I think that's it. Okay. So Sharon, great. So Sharon says, it's so great to have the connection with the mapping. It highlights so many issues that shelters face. Absolutely. And you can really see the journeys that women have to take. I just, remember Cynthia, the shelter director in Matthias Colombe, who says that for one of her residents or one of the survivors she works with, if they need to come to Winnipeg because of space issues or just because of safety issues, because their partners might be aware of where the shelter is, it takes them about 4 days of travel to make it to Winnipeg. I mean, that's just really mind-boggling. And you think about, the state of mind that a lot of survivors are in at the time. They're leaving an abusive partner. They're unsure of their future. There's a sense of instability. They're overwhelmed. And then having to do a 4-day journey, and especially with their children, right? It can just be really daunting and almost impossible for a lot of people. So it really speaks the need for multiple transportation routes, not just one, but multiple transportation systems. And especially now with climate change that, Ali spoke about. So the map is a really, really important piece, and I hope people get a chance to look at it. Okay, Danielle, thank you everyone for sharing the work that has been done. I was wondering, this may be a big question. I imagine the women's experience would have a lot of differences depending on the area, often less access to shelters and IPV supports in non-urban areas, which was touched on. With that data, do we have an idea of how we can try to address those? Absolutely correct in terms of addressing these issues, right? A lot of it is, again, like I said, in terms of transportation, multiple transportation routes, right? Women are obviously in many different areas with many different barriers, right? Whether that's physical, geographical barriers, right? The need for winter roads. But also Ali spoke about the huge price of flights, right? And so the cost of travel is also very inaccessible, and often just the timing of flights. They might not run. Well, they don't run every day, right? So having to wait. It's obviously having shelters with many different services. Those that again are culturally safe, culturally grounded, having access to shelters, those kind of things. Also access in terms of technology. Many of the places that Ali talked about don't have access to cell phones, don't have access to Wi-Fi, right? So what we need to increase technology for survivors in rural, remote, and northern areas. So I think that there's many things that we need to address. I don't know if Vanessa, Eloise, or Ali, if you want to answer that question, or even Sharon yourself, right? So Danielle's question is, with this data, do we have a sense of how we can address some of these barriers? But part of it is, Danielle, is getting this research, right? So there was very little research done about the needs and the specific circumstance of Indigenous women living in First Nations communities, or even, who live outside of those communities but are trying to access Indigenous supports, even those not specific to Indigenous shelters, right? So I think the first piece is really getting the data, the empirical research, and having conversations with those decision makers, right? Those in government, whether that be provincial for provincially funded programs, or federal for those services on First Nations reserves. But I'm just going to open it up to my colleagues to see if anybody else wants to answer that question.
I think that's something that the map is very powerful for, is actually seeing where the resources are and where they're not. Because I think that's like something that I kept reflecting on as I was creating the map, is like when you actually put it out there and you can visualize it, you can see how it's like so many services are concentrated to the southern part of the province, or to Winnipeg, or to only cities, right? In particular, I think the mental health and addiction services was a big one, that I noticed, very concentrated in Winnipeg in particular, and in the southern parts of the province. But I mean, there's many, as you'll see on the crisis supports and services map in particular, as you go through and look at the different supports and services featured on that map. It's really eye-opening.
Yeah. Thanks, Ali. Anyone else?
I think funding was a big thing that I saw in the findings, like just not having the ability to even like provide like substance use support, because that was one thing that Ali said, which is true. There is really no resources out in rural areas or on reserves for that support. Like a lot of them are concentrated in Winnipeg. Even though a lot of service providers did mention, wanting to have, more support with programming and certain things, like they just don't have the funding. I feel like that's a really big commonality that I saw when analyzing the research.
Yeah. Thanks, Eloise.
For me, in doing the interviews, and even outside of the interviews, there's a lot of time to just have a conversation and to share those stories. And so even with doing this work and looking at that data, I mean, folks could even, take it to many different areas in terms of, having those stories and having those conversations with people, and using that information to maybe, just like what Eloise was saying, developing programming, developing training to try and meet those specific areas. So, but this opportunity here in terms of doing these interviews and meeting people and having those conversations, it really highlights stories, and it highlights conversations that, anyone could have with in many different areas, but in particular into this situation for when it comes to women's shelters. So.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. Danielle, I hope that answered your question, and certainly feel free to reach out to me and to the team if you need to. But again, we'll have everything on the Resolve website. So I also Sharon also has another comment. She says, I'm excited to be part of the story. Yes, I'm optimistic that this study will encourage even more changes that are needed. Absolutely, Sharon. I totally agree with you. Yeah, so perhaps we can move on. We just have a couple minutes left. I don't see any other questions, so I think we can move on. So next slide. So at the beginning of the webinar, I said that we completed a literature review as one of the first pieces of the project. The literature review is available on the Resolve website, or you can access it with this QR code, which looks like has a little dinosaur in it. I've never seen that before. Interesting. I don't know if that's all right. And next slide. And again, thank you everyone for your interest and your participation in today's webinar, today's presentation. I hope you did find it useful. And of course, please feel free to stay connected with us. We have our Resolve website here where we post the results of this project, plus many, many other projects. So this project has the literature review on the website. We'll have the final report in probably another week or so. Again, the link to the story map. We will also put we usually make these webinars into YouTube's videos, so that will be on the website. The other thing that we do is we tend to create 1 or 2 page briefs based on the results of the project. So in case you don't want to read a 80-page report, these briefs are snapshots of the study and the major findings. So we typically do a practice brief that really highlights what practitioners need to know on a day-to-day basis when serving Indigenous women experiencing gender-based violence. We have a brief for policymakers or decision makers. So what are the key takeaways for you in terms of how you can better support survivors in the province and those who serve them, as well as a research brief. So what can other academics do in terms of furthering this work? So we are just in the middle of starting those, and we will have those on our website as well. And I think that's it. And the other thing is I don't see my email address on this, but if you ever want to get a hold of me, you can reach me at kendra.nixon@umanitoba.ca or go to the Resolve Manitoba website and you'll see my bio and my contact information. Is there a next slide? Oh, and then references. And I think that's it. I think there's one more. Oh, and I just want to, Danielle has said again, that did answer my question. Yes. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to answer. Of course, the first step is the importance of gathering this data, especially in an under-researched area. Absolutely, Danielle. And Michelle says, thank you. You are most welcome, Michelle. And so again, everyone, I want to thank the advisory circle. I want to thank Circling Buffalo for working with us on this project, as well as our funder, Wage Canada, and of course to the many research staff who worked on this project, and of course the voices of survivors and service providers. So that concludes our webinar today. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending, and miigwech, and hope to see you soon and stay in touch. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.